An Airbus A320 in heavy rain was attempting to land on an extremely short runway. But the aircraft's braking system had already failed, and the captain controlling the aircraft was very unfamiliar with this airplane. Even worse, a shocking message came from the control tower. Because of the rainstorm, the airport would be closed. At this moment, the lives of all passengers depended on whether the captain could make the right decision. On July 17, 2007, at Salgado Filho International Airport in Porto Alegre, Brazil, an Airbus A320 operated by TAM Airlines was preparing for takeoff. There were 181 passengers and 6 crew members on board. The destination was Congonhas Airport in São Paulo, Brazil. Flying the plane were 2 experienced captains. Captain Enrique Stefanini, 53 years old, had more than 30 years of flight experience, with a total flight time of 13,654 hours. The other captain, serving as the first officer on this flight, had a total flight time of 14,760 hours. Because airport traffic was busy, flights were constantly delayed. The captain asked the refueling crew to add more fuel than required. The reason the airport allowed this was that fuel prices here were lower. According to regulations, and as long as the airport allowed the aircraft to take on extra fuel without exceeding its maximum takeoff weight, this practice was called fuel reserve loading. However, this depended on the airport's situation, because the heavier the airplane, the longer the runway needed for takeoff and landing. Not every airport has a runway long enough. Therefore, whether overfueling is allowed is usually decided by the airport authority. For TAM Flight 3054, the captain added 2.4 tons of extra fuel, which meant the airplane's takeoff weight exceeded the maximum allowed value by 2.4 tons. Obviously, the captain at that time only considered the takeoff phase, but ignored one key issue. The heavier the airplane, the longer the runway needed for landing. And the Congonhas Airport where he was going to land, did it have such conditions? Most likely the captain did not think much about it. Congonhas Airport has 2 runways. When landing at maximum weight, theoretically, the main runway requires 1,781 meters. Its actual length is 1,880 meters, only about 100 meters longer. But this is on the condition that the runway is dry. If the runway is wet and slippery, the situation becomes completely different. What is even more dangerous is that the entire airport is surrounded by densely populated areas, and on the right side there is a large fuel station. This means landing again at maximum weight is extremely risky. With even a slight deviation, the plane could run off the runway, crashing into residential areas or fuel facilities below. At 5:20 p.m. local time, Flight 3054 received takeoff clearance. A few minutes later, the aircraft accelerated down the runway and took off smoothly. Even though 2.4 tons of extra fuel were loaded, the takeoff went normally. The plane flew steadily towards its destination. According to plan, this was a flight of about 1.5 hours. But as time passed, the weather became worse and worse. The captain contacted the Congonhas control tower to ask about the weather. The tower replied that it was raining. This was not the first time the captain landed at Congonhas Airport. Last time, he had also operated in the rain, and the runway had been just as slippery. But this time, he faced an additional problem. The reverse thrust system of engine number 2 could not be used. Reverse thrust is an important system that helps the aircraft slow down after landing by reversing the airflow of the engines. When the airplane lands, the engines open a device like a window, pushing the airflow forward to help the airplane slow down. The last time the captain landed this airplane, he also knew that the number 2 engine's reverse thrust system had failed. When the plane touched down, Because only one engine provided reverse thrust, the airplane produced asymmetric thrust and began veering to the left. But that time, the captain skillfully used the rudder to control the airplane and avoided danger. However, this time things were much worse. The control tower called the crew to inform them that because of the heavy rain, the runway was temporarily closed. The crew of TAM Flight 3054 became anxious because not only had they added extra fuel, but one reverse thrust system had failed, and the heavy rain made the runway extremely slippery. Just one day earlier, another aircraft at the same airport had skidded off the runway while landing in the rain. The captain knew very clearly that such weather for Congola's airport meant deadly danger. Although the aircraft was overweight, one thrust reverser was inoperative, and the runway was slippery, the captain still decided to continue toward Cancanias Airport. Soon after, the control tower once again informed them that the runway had reopened and landing was permitted. The plane slowly aligned with the runway. At 6:54 p.m., the aircraft successfully touched down. The captain thought this landing would go as smoothly as the previous one. 2 seconds after touchdown, the reverse thrust system of engine number 1 activated, but the reverse system of engine number 2 remained closed. As a result, asymmetric thrust occurred again, and the airplane began to veer slightly to the left. In theory, the captain should have used the rudder to correct it, but the deviation did not decrease, and the aircraft's speed did not drop. In the end, the passenger jet carrying 187 people ran off the runway and crashed into residential houses. There was still a large amount of fuel on board. A violent explosion triggered a massive sea of fire. The gas station nearby made the fire spread rapidly. Everyone on board was killed. 12 people on the ground also died, and 27 were injured. This disaster was recorded by multiple surveillance cameras. After the accident, the airport was closed for 3 full days. Investigators began their work to find out why the airplane could not stop. What exactly went wrong? The investigation showed that the runway was only 1,880 meters long, and the airport had long been considered one of the most dangerous in Brazil. Previously, the authorities had banned Fokker 100, Boeing 737-700, and Boeing 737-800 aircraft from using that runway. The reason was that although these aircraft could land on runways between 1,600 and 1,700 meters long when at maximum landing weight, they might require between 2,000 and 2,100 meters to come to a complete stop. Yet this runway was only 1,880 meters long. In addition, landing with a tailwind could increase the required stopping distance by 25%, and Cancanias Airport clearly had no such margin. Therefore, those aircraft were prohibited. However, what was puzzling was that the Airbus A320, a direct competitor of the Boeing 737 and nearly the same size, was not banned. The airport authorities believed that the Airbus A320's braking system was more advanced and efficient than that of the Boeing 737, and therefore it could safely land on a shorter runway. This assessment was correct when the runway was dry and all systems were normal, but for TAM Flight 3054, it was completely invalid, because this A320 not only had one thrust reverser inoperative, but also carried extra fuel and was fully loaded with passengers, almost at maximum weight. The problem did not stop there. Due to the heavy rain, when the plane's tires touched the runway, a thin layer of water formed between the tires and the ground, causing a sharp drop in friction. The braking system could hardly function. The tires were unable to grip the slippery surface and began to skid. Just one day before the accident,
a similar event had already occurred. The design flaw of Congonhas Airport's runway was that water could not drain smoothly. To prevent skidding, runways are usually built with drainage channels and small surface grooves that allow rainwater to flow into the drains and off the runway, thereby reducing standing water and the risk of hydroplaning. Unfortunately, although such construction had begun at Congonhas Airport, it was forced to stop because of the airport's heavy traffic volume and was never resumed. In addition, a large amount of rubber residue had accumulated on the runway. When airplane tires repeatedly touch down in the same area, a layer of rubber adheres to the surface, making the runway even smoother and further reducing braking efficiency. The airport authorities failed to clean these rubber deposits in time. Even worse, the safety buffer zone that should have been built at the end of the runway had not yet been completed. Investigators realized that this disaster was not caused by a single factor, but by multiple failures combined: severe weather, a malfunctioning braking system, an overweight aircraft, and poor runway maintenance. All these problems stacked together. But the true reason why the plane could not stop was not limited to these. According to surveillance footage, after landing, the airplane's speed did not decrease significantly. Even in the last few seconds before impact, it was still traveling at very high speed. What exactly caused this? The answer was not revealed until 3 years later, in 2009, when the flight data recorder and cockpit voice recorder were successfully decoded. The investigation discovered that the root cause of the accident could be traced back to 2006. That year, Brazil's largest airline, Varig, declared bankruptcy. At that time, Brazil's aviation industry was booming and flight demand increased sharply. Varig's collapse put huge pressure on other airlines, which faced serious shortages of capacity. But for some small airlines, this became an opportunity to expand. TAM Airlines grew rapidly in this environment. TAM decided to replace its aging Fokker 100 fleet with more advanced Airbus A320s, purchasing used aircraft from Pegasus Airlines. This particular airplane had already logged more than 21,000 hours and more than 10,000 takeoffs and landings. When it was delivered to TAM, the reverse thrust system of engine number 2 was already faulty. This was the very aircraft that later crashed on July 17, 2007. After that, TAM continued to purchase more A320 aircraft, but problems soon followed. The number of airplanes increased rapidly, but pilot training failed to keep up. Many pilots had previously flown Fokker models and were unfamiliar with the Airbus A320's electronic control systems. Normally, when introducing a new aircraft type, the airline should provide full transition training for pilots, but facing manpower shortages, TAM chose a shortcut. According to Airbus standards, pilots flying the A320 must complete at least 40 hours of simulator training. TAM provided only 12 hours, and the training was rushed and superficial. As a result, many pilots never truly mastered A320 operation. During that time, flight demand kept soaring, and airlines were unable to handle delays. Almost no flight could depart on time. Passenger dissatisfaction and pressure kept rising. Pilots, exhausted and insufficiently trained, were still forced to continue flying. Cabin crew members were often verbally abused by passengers. Such incidents did not happen occasionally, they happened every day. So TAM decided that if passengers insulted crew members, those crew would no longer stand at the cabin door. But then came another problem. If no crew was at the door, who would greet passengers? The company made a ridiculous rule. The pilots themselves had to stand at the door to greet passengers. But if the pilot stood at the door, who would remain in the cockpit to prepare the aircraft for flight? Even when this rule was enforced, passengers still didn't spare the pilots. Some boarded and scolded them anyway. In such an environment, the psychological pressure on both pilots and crew was unimaginable. All of this happened between 2006 and 2007, and all of these problems ultimately became closely connected to that tragic air disaster.
On July 17, 2007, the day of the accident, TAM Airlines Flight 3054 was preparing to land. At 6:43 p.m., the captain reminded the first officer, "We only have one thrust reverser working." The first officer replied, "Only the one on the left side." When there is only one working thrust reverser, the landing procedure is almost the same as a normal landing. After the aircraft touches down, both thrust levers are pulled back to idle, and then the reverse thrust system is activated. Regardless of whether one or both reversers are functioning, this process is the same. The only difference is that if only one reverser works, the aircraft needs about 55 additional meters of runway to come to a complete stop. However, when the aircraft touched down, the pilots made a fatal mistake. They pushed both thrust levers forward, but only activated the reverse system on the left engine. The right engine, the faulty one, was left as it was. The problem was that the thrust lever for that engine was not in idle position. It remained in climb power. In other words, the right engine was still pushing the aircraft forward at full power. In the following seconds, the crew did not yet realize what this meant. The right engine continued accelerating while the left engine was producing reverse thrust, one side pushing, the other pulling, causing the aircraft to lose all control. At that moment, there was no system left that could truly help slow the plane down. The aircraft spoilers, which automatically deploy to press the body down and reduce lift so the plane stays firmly on the runway, did not extend at all. The reason was that spoilers only deploy automatically when both thrust levers are in either idle or reverse position. But on Flight 3054, one lever was still in climb power, so the spoilers were never activated. The problem didn't stop there. The aircraft's main landing gear, located at the rear, was equipped with disc brakes, which normally handle 60 to 80% of the braking force. The braking system is designed to activate automatically after touchdown, but again, only if the spoilers are deployed. Since the spoilers didn't extend, the automatic brakes did not engage either. In other words, every system that could help stop the aircraft had failed. Even worse, the right engine was still accelerating, continuing to push the airplane forward. Even if the captain now pressed the brakes with full force, the aircraft would need 3 times the normal runway length to stop. But this airport didn't even have half that extra length, only an additional 100 meters. And that only under dry, clear weather conditions. Seeing that the airplane was not slowing down at all, the first officer sensed something was wrong. He noticed the warning light showing that the spoilers had not deployed. At that moment, the nose gear was about to touch down. 6 seconds later, the front wheels hit the ground. The first officer shouted anxiously, "Reduce speed." The plane began veering to the left toward the city. A terrified scream was heard in the cockpit. The cockpit voice recorder captured it, but it was impossible to identify who shouted. That was the last recorded sound. Moments later, the aircraft sped off the runway at 178 kilometers per hour and slammed into buildings in the city beyond. The investigation report later showed that the thrust lever, which should have been set to idle, was in climb power position. Whether this was caused by mechanical failure or pilot error could never be conclusively determined. Even more shocking, the investigation did not place primary blame on the runway length. However, in reality, the airport management had made serious mistakes as well. They had failed to upgrade the runway in time, and there were no safety zones at either end of the runway. Only after the accident were such safety areas urgently constructed. The air traffic control authorities should never have permitted landing under such extreme weather conditions. According to regulations, Congonhas Airport was not allowed to accept landings from aircraft operating with only one functioning thrust reverser. But TAM Airlines had been flying like this for more than a year. In addition, pilot training was severely inadequate. The procedures for handling emergency situations are supposed to be covered thoroughly in training. But TAM Airlines only gave its pilots 10 to 12 hours of training instead of the standard 40 hours. In summary, this tragedy was not merely the result of human error, but the collapse of an entire system, from company management to airport operations to government oversight. Every level was deeply flawed. For this reason, the Brazilian public angrily accused the government of corruption and incompetence. This is the tragic story of TAM Airlines Flight 3054.